Beneath the marble weight of Rome, under the vast basilicas where pilgrims still whisper prayers, lies another world. Colder, older, and quieter. The air down there feels different, tinged with stone dust and the faint scent of extinguished oil lamps. In the 4th century, when the catacombs stretched like veins beneath the new empire of faith, stonemasons carved tunnels for burial, prayer, and secrecy. Over centuries, as churches rose above ground, these tunnels became forgotten, sealed, renamed, until they belonged not to the living, but to memory itself. In one of these passages, archaeologists once found a door of bronze, warped by age but still holding the faint relief of an angel's wing. Behind it, legend says, rests a room the Vatican archivists seldom speak of. A library where names once blessed were later removed from the saints' rolls, their writings condemned as dangerous or impure. Not destroyed, only buried. The story begins with light. Thin, wavering light from a candle held against marble. The flame bends in the underground air, tracing Latin inscriptions half lost to damp. On the floor lies a fragment of a fresco. A woman in blue robes, her eyes lifted toward the sky, her name erased by a deliberate scrape of iron. She may have been Pelagia or Theodora or one of the countless ascetic women of the early church whose devotion did not fit the sanctioned mold. Her story, like many, was rewritten until it no longer resembled a life, but a warning. The archivists who tend this hidden chamber walk softly. They catalog scrolls written by hands long silenced, fragments of Origen, burned in Alexandria for imagining a mercy too vast, letters of Priscillian of Avila, executed for teaching that the soul was a shard of divine light, notes from desert mystics near Cetus, who spoke of union with God in the language of breath and starlight. These texts, fragile and half-decayed, seem less like doctrine and more like confessions whispered to eternity. The walls of the chamber are lined with cedar shelves blackened by candle smoke. Each shelf bears small clay seals stamped with forgotten symbols. A fish, a circle, a star, a hand in blessing. Inside, papyri sleep, brittle as moth wings. Scholars have dated them between the 3rd and 6th centuries, though their words drift between history and revelation. Some scrolls describe a Christ who smiled. Others speak of saints who healed without invoking hierarchy. Others of visions too intimate for the church's grand symmetry. Every so often, a breath of wind travels through the tunnels, carrying with it a sound like murmured Latin prayers. Some believe it's the sigh of old Rome breathing. Others, that the words themselves are not dead but dreaming. When archaeologists in the 1930s uncovered parts of the Domitilla catacombs, they found frescoes showing women celebrating Eucharist beside men, depictions quietly painted over in later centuries. The same brush that glorified holiness also softened it, reshaped it. Rome, in its devotion, feared what it could not command. In this subterranean library, faith and fear are bound in ink. Each erased name feels like a confession of power and loss. The mystics written out of history still flicker in the margins. Agnes of Bohemia, whose letters spoke of divine poverty as liberation. Hypatia of Alexandria, remembered not as a saint but as a martyr to reason. The Celtic wanderers who mixed scripture with the wind's song, whose manuscripts were burned when the empire demanded uniformity. The light in the chamber seems to move slower than time. Dust drifts like prayer ash. A single wax candle melts in silence beside a codex whose cover bears a faint golden cross. Its pages are empty or almost. When tilted toward the light, faint script glows in invisible ink made from crushed herbs and salt. Words of a tongue half Latin, half Greek. It tells of a man named Julian the Elder, who once wrote that truth cannot be owned, only remembered. He was condemned for that line alone. Some claim this chamber was discovered by a Jesuit scholar named Father Corrado in the early 1600s, though no record bears his name now. He was said to have vanished after presenting a sealed manuscript to the Vatican Library, a text that argued holiness was not bestowed by the Church but awakened from within. His books were burned, his portrait removed, but beneath the marble floor, where his candle once burned, the scent of frankincense still lingers. In the late 19th century, excavators mapping the medieval foundations of Chartres stumbled upon this lower labyrinth, a chamber of carved spirals, altars of chalk, and shallow basins cut into rock. The carbon dating placed the carvings between 2000 and 1500 BCE, long before the Virgin, long before Rome. They were sacred spaces once dedicated to the Mother of the Earth, the same goddess whose memory would later be rewritten into Mary's image. When the first Christian builders laid the cathedral above, they did not destroy what they found. They built around it. The labyrinth carved into the cathedral floor, where pilgrims still walk in meditative silence, follows the same geometry as the one beneath. Above, it is walked in prayer. Below, it sleeps in shadow. The two are mirror images, divided only by a few feet of stone and 1,000 years of faith. To descend there is to move backward through belief itself. The upper vaults echo with organ music, with Gregorian chant. The lower chambers answer in dripping water and the faint resonance of unseen air. At some point, no one is sure when, monks began to call this hidden level le sanctuaire sous la croisée, the sanctuary beneath the crossroads. The name fits, for it sits exactly beneath where the cathedral's great nave intersects its transept, the symbolic crossing of heaven and earth. But long before cathedrals spoke of crucifixion, the same spot marked a meeting place of rivers and roads, a convergence where traders, travelers, and druids gathered under the open sky to share silence and fire. Beneath that crossing still lies an ancient well, 70 feet deep, lined with chalkstone and sealed in the 12th century. It was called Puits de Saints Forts, the Well of the Strong Saints, but older names whispered by locals call it something else. Puits de la Mère, the Mother's Well. In 1976, a team of archaeologists reopened the lower section briefly during drainage repairs. They found votive offerings within the sediment, Roman coins, Celtic torques, fragments of amphorae, and, astonishingly, shards of glass etched with fish and doves. The mixture of pagan and Christian symbols puzzled them. But perhaps it should not have. This was not a place of replacement, it was a place of remembering. One faith layering gently upon another like candle wax poured over an older flame. Imagine it. The scent of damp chalk, the steady rhythm of your breath as you walk deeper, the echo of footsteps overlapping centuries. On one wall, faint red pigment outlines a spiral large enough for a man to stand within. In its center, a symbol half-cross, half-sun. The early builders understood what theologians later forgot: that sanctity does not belong to one story alone. It gathers, like water, finding its level wherever reverence exists. The masons who raised Chartres Cathedral in the 12th century carved strange faces along its capitals. Not saints, but green men, their mouths blossoming into vines. They chiseled the sun and moon beside the Virgin's feet. They built with knowledge passed down through craft, not scripture, geometry from the Pythagoreans, symbols from Egypt, echoes of the labyrinth below. To them, faith was not replacement but translation. When you stand in the lower chamber, the air trembles faintly, a resonance that cannot be measured but can be felt through the bones. Modern acousticians who tested it in the 1990s found that certain frequencies sung within the space amplified until they became almost visible, vibrating dust into rings. The same tone, sung above in the cathedral nave, dissolves instantly. Something in the shape of the chamber, perhaps intentional, perhaps accidental, makes the underground space a vessel for sound. The voice lingers, folding back upon itself. Pilgrims who have been allowed to descend describe the sensation as stepping into another heartbeat. Some say they feel watched, but gently, as if by the stones themselves. Others say they sense warmth rising from the earth. One monk in the 13th century wrote, "Under the cross of light is a cross of silence, and both are holy." In the Middle Ages, when plague swept through Europe, villagers left offerings near the sealed grate: bread, wax figures, drops of wine, gifts for whatever still dwelt below. They believed the old gods had not died, only agreed to sleep, and that their dreams protected the city above. Archaeological traces from these depths are fragmentary: shards of pottery with Greek invocations, scraps of parchment catalogued under unknown sectarian writings. In the 1980s, a restoration team working under the Basilica of San Clemente uncovered layers of older temples below the Christian church, Mithraic altars beneath the Christian crypt, and beneath those, Roman foundations older still. Each layer built upon the last, as though faith itself were a palimpsest rewritten but never fully erased. When Chartres burned in 1194, nearly everything was lost. Its roof, its relics, its wooden towers. Yet the labyrinth beneath survived untouched. And when the new cathedral rose from the ashes, it followed the same geometry, stone for stone. Even the blue glass in its windows, that deep, otherworldly blue that seems to glow from within, was colored with cobalt mined near the same ancient riverbank. The builders remembered, though no one could say why. Scholars have long debated why the cathedral's orientation is slightly skewed, not aligned perfectly east-west as most Gothic structures are. It faces, instead, a few degrees north, toward the position of the midsummer sunrise. That same alignment matches the entrance to the subterranean chamber. Perhaps coincidence, perhaps respect, perhaps the builders, in their wisdom, chose to anchor the cross not in conquest, but in continuity. In recent decades, explorers using ground-penetrating radar have mapped extensions of the lower chambers leading toward the old Roman road beneath the town, suggesting that the sanctuary once opened onto a larger complex, now collapsed. What they found in the data were shapes resembling cisterns, perhaps ritual baths, and one circular chamber marked by an anomaly, a cavity of air where none should exist. The readings stopped there. The site remains sealed. To imagine that place is to imagine memory itself. Layers of belief compacted into silence. Stones once touched by pagan hands now support altars to the Virgin. The prayers that echo above, Ave Maria, Ora pro nobis, fall downward, sinking through the floor until they reach the chamber of spirals and sleep beside older names. Isis, Demeter, the mother of all. Perhaps she listens still. At dusk, when the last tourists leave the cathedral square, the light spills through the western rose window, flooding the nave in color. For a moment, the labyrinth glows beneath their feet, invisible but alive. And somewhere below, in that deeper labyrinth of stone, the same pattern stirs in darkness, unseen, unbroken, waiting. Faith, it seems, is not a straight road but a crossroads, forever intersecting with what came before. The city above sings in Latin. The city below hums in silence. Together they make one long hymn, rising through centuries. When night falls and the bells of Chartres toll the hour, the sound vibrates downward through the pillars into the old earth. In that echo, one might imagine all the voices that have ever prayed there. Druids, monks, masons, pilgrims, joined in the same invisible choir. The sanctuary beneath the crossroads remains sealed. But sometimes, when the air is very still, the caretakers say they hear water moving below, like breath returning to a body. In the imagined library of the erased saints, every wall bears faint outlines of halos scraped clean. The sound of water dripping from ancient aqueducts becomes a metronome for reflection. The listener can almost hear pages turning, slow as heartbeats. Some of the manuscripts contain sketches, wings, spirals, constellations. Others list herbs used in early healing rites: rosemary, hyssop, myrrh. To the church, they were superstition. To those who held them, they were remembrance, the body's prayer to the earth. Perhaps faith is not built upon what we believe, but upon what refuses to die. And beneath the feet of those who walk the marble labyrinth above, the older one listens, turning endlessly, waiting for light soft enough to find it again. On the edge of the North Sea, where the wind carries both salt and scripture, there once stood a monastery carved into the cliffs. Its stones were black with sea spray, its windows narrow as candle slits, its halls filled with the steady rhythm of waves striking rock. Even now, the ruins remain, cold outlines of arches and steps, a few worn carvings of crosses half consumed by lichen. To stand there is to hear the breathing of history through the wind. It was founded, they say, in the 7th century, when the tide between faith and darkness was still uncertain. The monks who came to this place were not scholars or priests of power. They were seekers, men who fled the noise of kingdoms to find silence vast enough to hold God. They built their cloisters where land met sea, believing that the endless horizon was the closest mirror to eternity. Among them was one whose name appears only once in the surviving records of Lindisfarne's illuminated script: Brother Aidan of the Shadows. The line beside his name reads simply, "He listened to the dark." What that meant, no one knew. The monastery of Lindisfarne, on the tidal island off England's northeast coast, was a place where faith grew from isolation. Twice each day, the sea swallowed the causeway, cutting the monks off from the mainland. The tides governed their prayers. They rose before dawn, their chants drifting with the cries of gulls. They wrote by lamplight, ink mixed with soot and rainwater. At night, when the last bell faded, the world narrowed to the sound of wind against stone. It was said that Brother Aidan never slept during those hours. He would walk the cloisters alone, his candle trembling in the sea breath, speaking softly to something unseen. At first, the others believed he was reciting psalms. But one night, another monk followed him, and heard him whispering not in Latin, but in an older tongue, slow and tender, like water smoothing rock. When asked the next day whom he spoke to, Aidan only smiled. To what remains when the light leaves? The others called it poetic. The abbot called it dangerous. In one corner stands a reliquary, cracked and tarnished. Inside, not bones, but a small piece of glass, smoky, iridescent. Some historians think it's Roman. Others say it's Phoenician. But in the candlelight, it refracts colors like dawn over water. The monks who hid these relics left no explanations, only marks. A spiral, a hand, an open eye. Symbols of seeing beyond permission. In the margins of a manuscript dated 704 CE, a commentary on the Gospel of John, there is a note written in smaller, hesitant script. It reads, "Brother Aidan says the light of God is not only in the sun. He says it hides also in the shadow, waiting to be seen." Such words might seem harmless now, but in those years theology was not yet settled. To suggest that darkness could be holy, that absence was another kind of presence, was to walk the edge of heresy. And yet, it is in the margins of those manuscripts, beside careful Latin verses, that faint sketches appear. Spirals, moon shapes, the outlines of a figure kneeling before a cave. Aidan's fellow monks recorded strange things. That he would sit in the crypt beneath the chapel for hours, candle unlit, listening. That he could tell when storms were coming before the gulls grew restless. That once, during winter, when the tide froze against the rocks, he was found standing at the cliff's edge, murmuring, "The sea still moves beneath." After his death, the date uncertain, perhaps 709, the other brothers sealed his small cell and left it untouched. For centuries it remained closed, a simple archway bricked with stone. But in the 19th century, when archaeologists excavated parts of the ruined priory, they found his cell again. A square room facing the sea, no larger than a chapel pew. Inside was a stone bench, a shallow bowl carved into the floor, and along the wall scratches that, when traced, formed a pattern of waves. Among the fragments discovered there was a piece of parchment, darkened by centuries of damp. When cleaned, faint ink appeared, words written in Old Northumbrian. "When I speak, the dark replies, not with sound, but with breath." The handwriting matched marginal notes found in Lindisfarne's Book of Hours, leading scholars to conclude that this fragment may indeed have belonged to Aidan. If so, it represents one of the earliest mystical texts of Northern Christianity, a theology born not of doctrine but of solitude. The North Sea has always been a harsh teacher. Its tides erase and reveal with equal indifference. Those who live beside it learn to read what the light cannot show, the shimmer beneath, the movement of unseen things. Perhaps Aidan learned from the sea what books could not teach. That shadow is not the absence of light, but its companion. In the decades after his death, his story became legend. Fishermen said his spirit still walked the cliffs, carrying a lamp whose flame never burned but always glowed. Others claimed that when storms gathered, his voice could be heard in the wind, chanting psalms backward, as if returning prayer to its source. Perhaps that is what this place was meant for. Not to preserve certainty, but to protect the shimmer of wonder. By the 11th century, pilgrimages to Lindisfarne had begun. The faithful came not for relics, but for silence. They sat among the ruins and listened to the waves, repeating Aidan's words, When the light leaves, God remains. Some said that those who sat long enough could feel the air grow thick, as if the shadows themselves were breathing with them. In the archives of Durham Cathedral, an entry from 1321 describes a small chapel constructed near the ruins, dedicated to the Listener of the Dark. It was built from sea-black stone, and its altar bore no crucifix, only a single candle, which, according to the record, was never lit. The chapel no longer exists. It was dismantled during the Reformation. Yet local fishermen still call that cliff Capilla del Silencio, the Chapel of Silence. Modern historians often dismiss such legends as the inventions of monks who feared loneliness. But recent studies of early monastic writings suggest something deeper. In the Christian East, desert fathers like Evagrius and Isaac of Nineveh spoke of a luminous darkness, the moment when prayer transcends sight. Aidan, though far from those deserts, may have reached the same revelation by different means. Through fog, not sand. Through the roar of tides, not the stillness of dunes. A 20th century archaeologist named Margaret Keyes, who excavated Lindisfarne in the 1950s, described the experience in her journal. At dusk, as the tide cut us off from the mainland, the light dimmed to a deep blue-gray. Standing within the ruins, I felt an uncanny warmth in the air, as if the stones themselves remembered. Perhaps silence is not the absence of prayer, but its echo. She recorded an unusual finding: a small ceramic oil lamp buried near the monk's cell, its wick still preserved in hardened tallow. When tested, the oil was found to contain traces of whale fat, a rare material for monastic lamps, suggesting Aidan used what the sea offered. It burned longer, she noted, but with a dimmer flame. Perhaps that was the point. In art, he was later depicted holding such a lamp, the glow faint and trembling, the monk who chose not brightness, but endurance. To imagine him now is to imagine a man seated by the sea's edge, the sky heavy with stars, the water black, rippling silver at the horizon, his lips moving softly, not in petition, but in conversation. He is not speaking to a God above, but to the divine within the unseen, the stillness that underlies all motion. The rhythm of his voice blends with the waves until it is impossible to tell where one ends and the other begins. This, perhaps, was his gospel, that creation itself speaks, and that the truest prayer is listening. Those who have visited the catacombs speak of a strange calm that follows them for days, a silence that clings to their clothes like incense. They describe the sense that the walls are listening, not judging, only remembering. Beneath the grand geometry of basilicas, beneath centuries of decree, these buried saints continue their quiet liturgy. When the monastery fell into ruin under Viking raids, his cell remained untouched. The raiders, it is said, lit torches but would not enter. They claimed they heard whispers from within. Whether superstition or respect, they sealed it again. The sea reclaimed its sound. Now, 12 centuries later, visitors still come. The island is reachable only at low tide. Twice a day, the road vanishes beneath the water. The air tastes of salt and history. Standing by the ruins, one can hear the same endless rhythm Brother Aidan must have known. Waves colliding with stone, wind threading through arches, the faint hum of the earth's oldest prayer. When night falls, the horizon disappears. The sea becomes a black mirror, and in that mirror, perhaps, the divine looks back, not in blinding light, but in the soft shimmer of understanding that rises from stillness. Brother Aidan spoke to shadows, but maybe what he spoke to was himself, or rather, the part of the self that lives beyond sight, where the sacred hides patiently, waiting for silence deep enough to be heard. No monument marks his grave, only the whisper of wind, the salt on the air, the flicker of a remembered flame. And in that solitude, as waves murmur against the rock, one begins to sense what Aidan must have felt. That even darkness has breath, that shadow is not the end of faith but its beginning, the place where the divine listens back. Snow drifts softly over the stone roofs of the convent, a hush falling from the high alpine sky as though the mountains themselves are exhaling. Pines stand dark and still. In the courtyard, a shallow bowl of ice has formed in the cloister's fountain, capturing the pale moon like a coin. The sisters move like shadows along the covered walk, their footsteps softened by wool and winter. Far above them, in a timbered belfry that touches the cold stars, 3 bronze bells rest under linen shrouds. They have never rung, not once. The convent sits where 2 ancient paths cross, a pilgrim track threading toward the great St. Bernard Pass and a Roman road long since broken by avalanches. Travelers used to stop here to warm their hands and leave offerings of bread, wax, and small carved birds. Maps draw this place as a simple dot between ridgelines, but the ridges hold caves and the caves hold breath, and the wind keeps the old names of the passes long after the ink has faded. In the 14th century, when plague ran like a shadow through the valleys, the sisters rebuilt these cloisters with stone from a ruined watchtower. Their chapel window glows even now with the deep blue glass favored by the workshops of the Rhone. At the highest peak of the roof, the belfry waits, a wooden crown upon a prayer. In the year 1353, a bell founder from the valley below climbed the mule track with carts and charcoal and molds packed tight with clay and hair. His craft was older than the borders, older than the language of law. Bronze is a remembered metal, copper, tin, a whisper of lead, poured like a small river into forms shaped by fire and patience. He set his pit in the frozen ground, lined it with stone, and covered it with brick. The sisters kept vigil while the alloy shimmered into life. When it cooled, they brushed ash from the lips of the new bells and traced the inscriptions with gloved fingers. 2 were etched in Latin, as custom required: Vivo est voco, mortuos plango, fulgura frango. I call the living, I mourn the dead, I scatter the lightning. The smallest carried a different script, a line that curled like water. It was not Latin. It was not a psalm. The letters belonged to the tongue of the valley, half Provençal, half Lombard, and they said, "Guard the dream that guards the soul." The prioress, a woman with frost in her hair and warmth in her voice, read the words and closed her eyes for a long time. Bells are baptized in the church, washed with salt, anointed with oil, given names. They are meant to carry prayer across distance like swallows across the air. To place such words upon a bell invited suspicion, and yet the sisters let the inscription stand. The world above the tree line is made of stone and silence. It teaches a person to respect what shelters breath. They named the smallest bell Somnia, the dream. The others they named for the archangels whose feasts anchor the winter calendar. No one knows how many names were erased from the canon, how many stories rewritten. But in the end, history has a way of breathing again. What was once forbidden resurfaces as echo in art, in poetry, in a single phrase that endures. Winter deepened. Snow laid its white hand over every path. The bells were hauled, one by one, into the belfry and dressed in linen the color of candle smoke. The day came for their blessing. The bishop sent word he could not climb. Storms and illness kept him below, but he dispatched 2 canons to perform the rite. They arrived breathless, ascended the creaking stairs, and traced the sign of the cross upon cold bronze. When their gloved hands reached the small bell and felt the unfamiliar script, they paused. One of them frowned as if a draft had touched him. Scribes record little more than a sentence. A matter concerning the bells was postponed. The blessing halted. A sealed letter traveled back down the mountain and then farther still, toward a chapter that gathered new decrees in those years with the same efficiency that winter gathers snow. There were rumors of visions in the valleys, of women who spoke of a gentler order in which music belonged to the poor and dreams were to be honored like relics. There were parish priests who allowed songs in the old tongue when the frost was hard and bread was thin. There were poets who wrote of God as a hearth in a stone hut. The church loved order. The snow loved no one. The bells remained in their shrouds. Days passed. Weeks. When the thaw came and the mule track opened, the letter returned. It spoke politely of prudence. It mentioned confusion of tongues and inappropriate verses. It advised a seal for the time being. Linen became rope. Rope became decree. A wooden bar was fixed against the clappers. The bells were rendered mute, their mouths pressed closed not by iron, but by caution. Years folded. The sisters learned to pray without sound. They chanted softly in the stone chapel, letting the mountains answer. When travelers asked why the belfry slept, the nuns smiled and served them warm broth. A child born during the autumn migration of birds grew old without hearing a single peal. Silence spread like sunlight over snow. In the almanacs, a blank space appeared where feast day notes should have been. Yet the convent endured, and the seasons braided themselves around the mute tower. Bronze remembers. Even in sleep, it gathers what the air carries. Salt from tears, soot from lamps, frost from breath. Spectrographs in modern museums can read such traces like a diary. But centuries ago, the sisters had only fingertips and attention. They would climb the belfry to dust the bells and feel a faint warmth where none should be. In winter, when the stars felt near enough to touch, they pressed their palms against the curves and sensed a quiet vibration, as if the mountain itself were speaking through the metal. They began to call the bells our sleeping choir. From time to time, officials visited. The records in a diocesan archive speak of inspections in 1389 and 1412, of polite conversations about wording and custom. In one margin, a bored cleric doodled a tiny bell with wings. In another note, someone underlined the valley inscription and wrote in Latin, "Versus dulcis," said Alienus, a sweet line, but foreign. Foreign to whose breath, the sisters wondered. Snow belonged to everyone, and so did the sky. In a bitter January toward the end of the 15th century, storms hammered the pass and avalanches erased the road. The convent's stores dwindled. A foundling boy left at the gate, wrapped in a wool cloak with no name sewn to it, grew feverish. The prioress climbed to the belfry with a rope in her hand, as if faith could be persuaded by a knot. She stood beside Somnia, laid her ear against the linen, and whispered the valley line, "Guard the dream that guards the soul." She did not pull the rope. She did not break the bar. She only listened. The boy's fever broke before dawn. Coincidence is an easy word for those who live at sea level. Archaeology, when it finally came to this altitude, arrived not with trumpets but with notebooks and wool socks. In 1897, during repairs to the roof, 2 workers and a young conservator from Geneva opened the belfry's hatch and found the 3 shrouded shapes. The linen was brittle. The knots had fused with time. They cut carefully, thread by thread, until bronze met light. The bells' skins were dark as river stones, their inscriptions still sharp. The conservator, whose handwriting is angled and elegant, copied each letter into a ledger. He measured the diameters, calculated approximate strike notes by tapping with a padded mallet, G for the largest, D for the middle, A for the smallest, and noted with surprise how the smallest bell hummed longer than its size should allow. He sniffed the bronze and wrote, almost sheepishly, "Smell of resin?" Perhaps incense soaked the metal over centuries of winter liturgy. He recommended, in a paragraph lined with disclaimers, that the bells be rung to ascertain any fracture before frost could complete what superstition had begun. The prioress at the time was elderly and kind. She offered him tea flavored with juniper and replied that their silence had become part of the order's breath. He agreed and then made a small private entry the same evening. At dusk, the bells seemed to sing without moving, likely wind in the timber, or the mind. He underlined the last 3 words twice. Reason is a lamp, wonder is the oil. Bell founders say bronze keeps memory in overtones. Each bell carries not just one voice but a family of echoes. Hum note, prime, tierce, quint, nominal, layered like snowflakes over a ridge. Medieval founders did not true these partials as later craftsmen would. Their bells speak in modes older than tempered scale, shadows within tone. If struck, these 3 would not sound like the town below. They would sound like wind through pines, like breath in a stone corridor, like footsteps on ancient ice. The sisters, who knew nothing of acoustics, knew this already. They called the bells by the names of weather. The large one stormlight, the middle cedar, the small one dream. The candle burns low. The air grows cool. Somewhere above, the bells of Rome ring the evening hour. Down below, the sound arrives softer, slower, as though centuries are still catching up. Once, early in the 20th century, A young sister climbed the belfry after reading a poet from the valley whose lines tasted of wild honey and river stones. She laid a feather against Somnia's lip and watched it tremble. Hunger years had come again. The world outside lost itself in noise. Marches, orders, iron, smoke, and the convent became a pocket of unbroken snowfall. The sisters kept bees in summer and knitted in winter and listened to silence as if it were scripture. The feather quivered each time the wind shifted, and the young sister wrote in her journal, "Perhaps all bells ring already, and we are the ones who must grow quiet enough to hear." In the 1970s, a metallurgist hiking the pass on holiday obtained permission to examine the bells. He found the alloy to be typical of late medieval casting, nearly 80% copper, a fifth part tin, with the faintest breath of lead and antimony. Hammer marks still scarred the crowns where iron strakes had once gripped them for hoisting. He traced the foundry mark, a small cross within a circle, back to a family of casters who wandered between Savoy and the Val d'Aosta, setting up pits wherever parishes gathered enough coin for bronze. In a footnote to his article, he wrote, "The inscription in the vernacular is unusual, though not without precedent. Bells often carry prayers. This one carries counsel. Counsel is a mild word for a thing that can move snow. There were proposals every few decades to free the clappers and let the bells speak. Each proposal arrived with signatures and seals and practical reasons. Safety, testing, tradition restored. Each time, the sisters folded the papers like altar linens and placed them gently in a drawer. Not defiance exactly, conservation of a different sort. Some silences are not absence but architecture. On certain winter nights, when the moon is low and the sky is a deep, forgiving blue, walkers on the road below report hearing a tone from the mountain, then a second, then a thin bright thread of a third note answering from within the snow. No clappers move.
Noro upspul.
The sound seems to come from the wood and the ridge and the air itself, as if the bells have taught the mountain how to sing on their behalf. Local shepherds say the tones calm the dogs. Drivers slow. Children stop crying. A scientist who once stayed at the convent with a box of equipment blamed temperature inversions and a particular resonance trapped in the timber. His preliminary readings yielded a persistent 111 Hz tremor under the higher partials, the same frequency known to soften the human body into quiet. He left with graphs and a puzzlement he did not publish. The smallest bell keeps its line from the valley intact. The letters are shallow now, a whisper of script, but they remain. Guard the dream that guards the soul. The phrase is neither doctrine nor disobedience. It is simply a way of breathing in a high place. The sisters say it before sleep the way sailors at sea murmur the names of familiar stars. Their liturgy is candle and wool and bread shared with whomever knocks in snow. Their matins begin in darkness and end with the faint outline of peaks becoming visible through the chapel window, where the first light pours like milk into the glass. No decree has arrived in many years. No letter climbs the mule track in a leather satchel. The ropes remain bound. The bars remain in place. The belfry gathers starlight and gives it back in silence. The bells hold their voice the way a lake holds the sky. If you stand in the courtyard at dusk and look up, you can almost see breath rising from the linen, a pale veil, then nothing. The fountain's ice mirrors the belfry upside down, and in that small inverted world the bells hang over a sky of stone. A traveler once said he heard the snow ringing underfoot as he left. He turned and bowed toward the tower and continued down the path, lighter than when he came. Perhaps the bells were never meant to shatter the valley with sound. Perhaps their task was to keep watch over a silence large enough to shelter the most fragile parts of faith, the parts that believe dreams are not waste but wisdom, that music can live inside metal without striking, that prayer can be a tone the body remembers even when the ear does not. Some things are guarded by noise, others are kept safe by quiet. High in the Alps, under a roof brushed by winter stars, 3 bronze mouths remain closed and more eloquent for it. Snow keeps their secret. Timber cradles their weight. The mountain carries their song. And if one night a wind rises and you think you hear a bell where no bell has ever rung, you may be right. Or you may be listening to the echo of your own guarded dream, answering from the deep with a note older than language, as soft and certain as falling snow. One could imagine the last archivist closing the bronze door gently, his fingertips tracing the outline of an angel's feather carved into its edge. He does not lock it. He only whispers a prayer, not for forgiveness, but for remembrance. At dawn, the desert wakes without sound. Light arrives not as color but as breath, a slow unveiling that turns the dunes from shadow into bone. The horizon quivers, and for a heartbeat the whole land seems made of glass. Somewhere beyond the mirage, among the red cliffs of Egypt's eastern desert, stand ruins that look less like architecture and more like pauses in eternity. Archaeologists call this place Kelia, the cells, a scatter of caves and stone hermitages stretching for miles between Wadi Natrun and the Nile. It was here, 15 centuries ago, that the first Christian monks sought silence so absolute it could be mistaken for the voice of God. They came with nothing, no bells, no doctrine, only the conviction that solitude could teach what Scripture could not. When the wind passes over these stones today, it carries a faint dust of pigment, traces of icons once painted on the walls. A palm, a circle, a faint wing. Time has scoured the rest away. Yet in that fading there is a strange preservation, as if the desert, unwilling to forget, has chosen to whisper instead. It was among these ruins, in 1907, that a team of French excavators uncovered something unusual. A slab of limestone inscribed not in Greek or Coptic, but in a mixture of both. The letters curved like ripples, their edges softened by sand. Beneath the silt lay a carved line of words. The word of God is stone, and the wind is its voice. Scholars called it the Stone Gospel, though it was no book, only a tablet the size of a small altar. Nearby, in a collapsed cell, they found shards of pottery etched with phrases, fragments of a vanished scripture that spoke not of commandments but of listening. He who builds in silence builds forever. The fragments were dated to the 5th century AD, a time when the desert swarmed with seekers. Anchorites fled the cities of Alexandria and Antioch to live among scorpions and stars. Their names still drift through hagiographies. Anthony, Macarius, Melania, Serapion. They carried with them scraps of the Gospel of Thomas, the sayings of the Desert Fathers, and teachings the empire would later call dangerous. Hints that the divine was not distant but breathing in every grain of sand. Some historians suggest that the Stone Gospel belonged to one of those mystics, perhaps to Abapesius, the monk who, according to Coptic legend, spent 70 years conversing with angels of dust. Others think it may have been carved by refugees from Sinai, fleeing after Emperor Justinian closed their monastery for errors of interpretation. What those errors were, the chronicles do not say. The stone itself is rough limestone from the nearby quarries of Gebel el-Kader. Its surface bears tiny cuts where a bronze chisel once traced letters by candlelight. Modern scanning revealed layers of overlapping text, faint inscriptions beneath the visible one, as if the same slab had been reused across generations, each monk engraving a new revelation over the fading words of the last. A palimpsest not of parchment, but of faith itself. Standing in that dry silence, the archaeologists reported an uncanny stillness. No insects, no echo. Their guide, a local Bedouin named Salah, refused to camp near the site. The stones breathe, he said, and indeed, at night, when temperature drops and the limestone contracts, the entire hill emits soft pops and sighs, as though exhaling centuries. Outside, night settles over the city. The marble glows faintly under moonlight. Tourists pass unknowingly above 1,000 unseen chambers. And beneath them, the erased saints wait, not as ghosts, but as memory made eternal. The monks of Kelia built their dwellings in pairs, 2 cells sharing one wall, 2 hermits sharing prayer but never speech. Between them ran a narrow channel through which they could pass a small loaf of bread or a written saying. Archaeologists found hundreds of such fragments, called ostraca, small potsherds scrawled with ink. Most bear brief phrases: patience, remember the dust, I saw light where there was none. But some carry lines clearly drawn from the same source as the Stone Gospel. One reads, "Do not speak the holy name. Let the stones say it for you." By the 6th century, similar inscriptions began appearing farther east, in the Sinai. Pilgrims climbing Jebel Musa, the mountain of Moses, carved crosses and stars beside older Nabatean symbols. Among them, a few letters in the same hybrid script were found, forming partial words. Pneuma, spirit, breath. The scholars who compared them concluded that the stone gospel had traveled, carried by wandering monks who believed the desert itself was a living scripture. To them, every dune was a line, every wind a syllable. They read creation as one long chant between silence and revelation. The apophthegmata patrum, the sayings of the fathers, preserve a faint echo of that theology. One monk asks another, "How shall I find God?" The elder replies, "In your cell. Sit, and your cell will teach you all." Perhaps the stone gospel was the cell's own voice, the earth teaching what men tried to translate. Modern visitors to Wadi Natrun still describe a strange peace there. The horizon stretches so wide that the mind forgets where the body ends. Pilgrims say the silence is physical, pressing against the ears until one begins to hear heartbeat and wind as the same rhythm. Scientists measuring the acoustics of the ancient caves recorded resonances around 110 to 112 Hz, a frequency known to induce calm and heightened focus. The monks could not have known the number, but they must have known the feeling. Their chants, sung slowly in the Coptic tone, match it exactly. A letter preserved in the monastery of St. Anthony the Great, written around 550 AD, mentions brothers who carve words upon rock that the wind may pray with them. It warns against those who seek the voice of God in the desert air, for there the tempter also speaks. Yet between the caution and the fear hides admiration. The author admits that when he himself journeyed across the red hills of the eastern desert, he felt a peace more radiant than the liturgy. The desert, it seems, converts by quiet. When the French expedition shipped the stone gospel to Cairo in 1910, the tablet cracked cleanly in two. The break ran through the final line of the inscription, and the breath returns to the dust, and the dust remembers the word. Perhaps holiness was never meant to be a crown. Perhaps it was always a whisper, passed hand to hand through time, until the world quiets enough to listen again. The curators sealed the halves behind glass, but over time the letters faded again. By 1939, photographs show them almost invisible. Curiously, when the museum lights are dimmed, faint glimmering returns, the stone glowing with mineral fluorescence under the weaker beam, as if the gospel prefers shadow. In later years, desert hermits of the Coptic and Syrian traditions revived the practice of inscribing short prayers onto rock. They carved not commandments but reminders, "Be still, forgive the wind," a continuation of that same lineage, patient and wordless. Even in modern excavations, archaeologists find new fragments each season. In 2018, a dig near Deir al-Surian uncovered a stone marked with a spiral and a phrase in early Arabic script. The voice of God is the space between two silences. The scholars called it poetic coincidence. Others called it proof that the gospel had never vanished, only translated itself into every new tongue the desert learned. Imagine standing there at twilight. The sky fades from gold to iron. The sand cools beneath your feet, giving off the faint scent of salt and thyme. All around you, the stones glow softly, each grain catching the last light like an ember. You realize that the desert is not empty. It is full of what has been left unsaid, full of listening. Perhaps that was the message carved by those monks so long ago, that revelation does not come in thunder or decree, but in the hush that follows, that the divine needs silence as air needs space, that the truest scripture is not written but endured. When night finally falls over Wadi Natrun, the horizon disappears, and the wind begins its slow recitation again. It moves through the ruins, brushing each doorway like a turning page. The stars above shimmer like unblinking eyes, their light older than language. If you listen long enough, you can almost hear it, the faint vibration of stone answering wind, syllable to syllable. A gospel without ink, still being written by time. And in that soundless dialogue, one understands what those ancient hermits must have known, that every silence is sacred speech, and every grain of sand remembers the word that made it. At the back of an old Italian church, where the incense no longer rises and the floor still smells faintly of wax. There is a small wooden door few people notice. Behind it lies the sacristy, the heart of preparation, where vestments once hung and chalices waited for light. The air there is cool and slightly metallic, the scent of age and silver. Against the far wall, under a drape of worn linen, rests a mirror. No one knows who placed it there. The records of Santa Lucia al Monte, a 14th-century monastery perched above the Bay of Naples, mention a speculum devotionis, a devotional mirror, delivered in 1452 by an artist from Siena, commissioned to adorn the chapel of confession. Mirrors were not uncommon in sacred spaces then. They symbolized purity, the soul's reflection of divine light. Yet this one was different. Some truths do not vanish when forbidden. They simply change their name and keep breathing beneath the marble floors of Rome. It was not polished glass, but burnished silver, its surface slightly convex, so that whoever gazed upon it appeared surrounded by a trembling halo of distortion. Around the rim ran an inscription in Latin, "In lumen videbis umbram." In the light, you will see the shadow. The monks hung it beside the altar where priests would wash their hands before Massachusetts. It was meant to remind them of humility, that in seeing themselves, they might remember their frailty. But over time, the mirror became a source of unease. In the winter of 1465, Brother Matteo, a scribe of the convent, recorded in the margin of his breviary, "The mirror shows too much." He did not explain what he meant, only that he could no longer bear to stand before it. The following year, the abbot ordered it covered with linen, as it remains today. Centuries later, restorers entering the sacristy found the cloth stiff with dust, the edges embroidered with faint fleur-de-lis. When they lifted it, their candles reflected not themselves but the room behind them, reversed and darkened, as if the mirror had swallowed time. Beneath the inscription, faint etchings shimmered, small figures half dissolved in oxidation. One appeared to be an angel with its wings folded inward, another a human face split down the center, half serene, half weeping. Experts examined the mirror under magnification. They found that its silver layer had been alloyed with mercury, a technique used by Renaissance craftsmen to create deeper luminosity. Yet the ratio was unusual. Too much mercury, too little silver. Such a mixture distorts reflection, creates movement as though the image breathes. Some scholars think it was an accident, others that it was deliberate, the artist's attempt to capture the living shimmer of the soul. The archives of Siena list a craftsman around that time named Niccolò de Vanni, an apprentice of the school of Lorenzetti, known for his experiments with mirror gilding. His name appears once in correspondence with the monks of Santa Lucia, and then nowhere again. A rumor, written a century later by a Jesuit chronicler, claims he went blind shortly after completing the piece. Whether myth or warning, the story lingered. That the mirror did not show one's face but one's intention. That if the heart was pure, the reflection appeared clear. If burdened, it rippled with darkness. Theological debate followed. Some saw it as proof that divine illumination could pass through matter. Others feared it as a relic of older, forbidden magic, a survival from hermetic mirrors used by alchemists to observe the shadow of the divine. Naples, in those centuries, was a city of miracles and earthquakes, of saints who bled and images that wept. Between faith and fear there was little space for neutrality. The monks grew wary. They said the mirror drew too much light. They covered it again, sealed the sacristy, and recorded nothing more. In the archives of Constantinople, once the golden heart of empire and faith, there is a story that never found its place among the Gospels. It is not written in the Bible, nor spoken from any pulpit, but it glows faintly between the margins of forgotten manuscripts. It is called, by those who still whisper of it, the Gospel of the Moon. When the church fell into disuse after the 18th century, the mirror was forgotten. Only in the 1920s, when restorers catalogued the surviving artworks, did it resurface. The inventory describes it briefly. Silver mirror, diameter 42 centimeters, glass warped, reflective, origin uncertain. It was sent to storage. Yet even in storage, it refused to rest. Workers reported finding condensation on its surface, though the room was dry. One claimed he heard faint murmuring when standing near it. Another said the air around it felt cooler, as if a breeze moved from within. No official record confirms these stories, but in the ledger beside its entry, a later hand wrote in pencil, "Do not move, do not polish." Decades passed. The war came and went. The church survived, battered but upright, its frescoes blackened by smoke. In 1957, during restoration, an art historian named Elena Marchesi requested to see the mirror. Her notes, preserved in the archives, read like the diary of a dreamer. The surface is alive. My own image appears distant, as though I am standing inside another world. The shadow behind me bends before I do. The Latin motto is correct. In the light, one sees the shadow. But the shadow is gentle, not fearful. It moves like thought. Marchesi spent weeks studying the alloy. When she placed the mirror under filtered sunlight, she discovered faint engravings invisible by candle or electric light. Delicate filigree of vines and wings. Words in Greek, phos en Scotia, light in darkness. The craftsmanship was extraordinary, suggesting the maker had training both in religious art and in metallurgical alchemy. In her final report, Marchesi concluded that the mirror was intended as a meditation tool, not an ornament, an object to teach self-knowledge through imperfection. It is, she wrote, a theology in metal. Still, the church authorities ordered it veiled once more. Devotion, they said, must not become fascination. Today, the mirror still hangs in the sacristy. The linen that covers it has been replaced many times, but the silence around it endures. Visitors sometimes feel drawn to that little door behind the altar without knowing why. Some describe hearing a faint chime, like a single drop of water falling into silver. Others claim they dream of faces reflected in darkness after standing near it. The parish priest smiles when asked and says only, "We keep it for humility." In recent years, conservators using infrared light examined the back of the silver plate and found another inscription, hidden beneath the wooden frame, written in reverse, like a signature meant for the mirror's own eyes. It reads, "Quod non videtur lumini est." It begins not with light, but with reflection. What is not seen is light. Those words could have come from any mystic of the Middle Ages, from Dionysius the Areopagite, who wrote of luminous darkness, or from the alchemists of Florence, who believed light and shadow were two halves of the same creation. Yet here they were, concealed in an object that showed both. The mirror's power, if it can be called that, is not to frighten but to soften, to remind that every reflection carries what it cannot reveal. The linen covering it now is sheer enough that light filters through. A ghost shimmer, a pale moon behind fabric. It no longer threatens theology. It teaches tenderness. Once a year, during Holy Week, the sacristan uncovers it to dust the frame. He works in silence. The morning sun from the narrow window strikes the metal for a brief moment before he draws the cloth back over it. In that instant, the whole room brightens. Not dazzling, but calm, as if light has found its own mirror and recognized itself. Perhaps that was always the purpose. To look into that silver is to understand what those early monks feared and desired in equal measure. That reflection is not vanity, but revelation. That the divine gazes back not to judge, but to remind. The mirror in the sacristy is not cursed. It is patient. It waits for someone to look long enough and quietly enough to see not their face, but the breath of light shaping it. And when they do, when the veil lifts and the shadow smiles, they will know, as the artist once did, and perhaps went blind from knowing, that the sacred was never elsewhere. It has always been the gleam in the darkness, waiting to be seen. Night settles differently in a convent. It does not fall. It gathers layer by layer, like linen folded over the day. Candles shorten, wax softens, footsteps fade into the hush of prayer. Only the sound of quills, of faint breathing, of robes brushing stone, remains. Yet in one convent, in a remote corner of Burgundy, another sound was born beneath that stillness. A voice where no voice was permitted. The year was 1326. The convent of St. Madeleine stood on a hill above the river Saône, its walls washed with lime, its bells small but bright. The sisters lived by the rule of Saint Benedict. Silence after sunset, no song outside the divine office. But the world beyond their walls was turning toward fear. The Inquisition's decrees had reached the monasteries. Theologians debated how women should worship. Song, they said, might inflame feeling. Emotion could mislead. The female voice, especially in harmony, was called perilous to the soul. Scholars say the manuscript was first seen in the 11th century, in a monastery that overlooked the Sea of Marmara. The building itself is gone, burned during the Latin sack of 1204, but its memory lingers in fragments of vellum unearthed by archaeologists in the 1930s. These fragments bear verses in Greek and Syriac, written in silver ink that shimmers like water. When held to the light, the letters fade. When tilted to darkness, they return, as though they were never meant for day, only for night. Yet the sisters sang. It began with Sister Beatrice, the convent's organista. Her training had come from her father, a master of polyphony in Dijon before she took her vows. She carried music like others carried breath. In her cell, she kept a small slate on which she etched fragments of melody, lines that curved not toward triumph, but toward tenderness. One night, while copying psalms by lamplight, she began to hum a phrase that would not leave her. It rose slowly, like the first glow of dawn, then dissolved into a hush. The words were not Latin, but French. Que la nuit soit douce à ton âme. May the night be gentle to your soul. The following evening, 2 younger novices lingered outside her cell and joined in softly. Their harmonies slipped through the corridor like a sigh. Soon others followed, 6 voices, then 12, gathering after Compline when the abbess had retired. They met in the weaving room, its windows shuttered, its air thick with the scent of flax and candle smoke. There they sang, not hymns of conquest or judgment, but lullabies for the spirit, songs of mercy, of cycles of quiet return. What they created became known centuries later as the Secret Hours, a collection of 42 short hymns written in plain chant notation on reused parchment. Each melody fits within a narrow range, meant to be sung softly, almost whispered. Musicologists who studied the surviving fragments found modal patterns older than the Gregorian tones, closer to the chants of Hildegard of Bingen, yet simpler, more circular. Their rhythm matches the heartbeat at rest. How the songs survived is itself a miracle of paper. In 1849, during repairs to the Abbey Library, a mason dismantled a false wall and discovered a small wooden chest sealed with wax. Inside were fragments of parchment wrapped in linen. The ink had faded to brown, but the neumes, those early musical marks, still floated like tiny birds across the page. Along the margins, faint names were written in red: Beatrice, Isabel, Clemence, Althea. One page bore a dedication in an elegant hand. For those who sing when they must be silent. It was enough to reawaken the story. The documents surrounding St. Madeleine tell of an inquiry in 1330, a visitation by clerics from Lyon who accused the convent of irregular gatherings. The records describe a group of sisters meeting at night, producing harmonies without authorization. The songs, the report claimed, contained unorthodox tenderness, comparing divine love to sleep and breath rather than to fire or sword. The abbess, a pragmatic woman, denied knowledge. The sisters promised obedience. The inquiry closed quietly, but the music continued, more cautious, woven into permitted psalms, hidden in the folds of known melodies like prayers smuggled across borders. One example survives: the hymn Stella Dormiens, the sleeping star. On the surface, it praises Mary's purity. Beneath, its countermelody traces the shape of a cradle rocking. The Latin text conceals vernacular syllables when sung aloud: do, repose toi, sweet one, rest. It is both devotion and lullaby, addressed to God and to the listener's own weary soul. Some believe it was the work of the hesychasts, monks who practiced silence so deep that their breathing matched the rhythm of the stars. Others think it came from the Gnostics who survived the fires of Alexandria, carrying a gospel too luminous for orthodoxy. The scroll speaks not of sin or redemption, but of rhythm, the sacred pattern between light and shadow. It tells of a Christ who walked not beneath the sun but under the moon, teaching that faith was not to be seen, only felt. Historians believe the sisters coded their music using rhythmic breath marks, invisible to censors, small variations in spacing that instructed when to lengthen or shorten notes. To the untrained, it looked like ordinary chant. To those who knew, it became an entire secret vocabulary of emotion. Modern scholars compare it to embroidery, pattern hidden within pattern, thread under thread. By the mid-14th century, plague had reached Burgundy. Fields emptied, bells tolled endlessly. The sisters sang even then, though many voices fell silent in the span of a single winter. One parchment fragment bears a stain that chemical tests identified as human tears mixed with candle soot. The notation beside it halts mid-phrase. Below, in small handwriting, "Silence carried her away. After the plague, the convent's choir dwindled. Music became liturgy again, sanctioned and plain. The secret hours faded into memory. But local shepherds kept a custom long after. They sang a short lullaby to their flocks before nightfall, a tune with the same shape as Beatrice's refrain. Across generations, the melody wandered from pasture to parish, stripped of words, reborn as folk song. In 1932, the ethnographer Marie Thevenin recorded elderly women near Chalon humming a cradle song they called La Voix Douce. Its melody matched almost note for note the chant written 6 centuries earlier. The line survived where parchment did not, carried in the human body, unbroken. The convent itself still stands, its cloister cracked, its stones warm with centuries of sun. Visitors hear only the faint echo of their own steps. But sometimes, when the wind moves across the arches just right, a resonance trembles there. A long, low chord that seems to come from the walls themselves. Acousticians who measured it found the frequency precisely 220 Hz, the A below middle C, the note around which every choir in the West once tuned. Coincidence, perhaps, or remembrance. Inside the small museum adjoining the convent, the fragments of the secret hours rest under glass. Each bears the scars of time, wormholes, water stains, the soft edges of prayer. One page shows the complete lyric of a hymn never before catalogued. Translated, it reads, "Do not fear the dark. It listens. Do not shun the silence. It sings. The night is a chapel with no door." In those years, Constantinople was a mirror itself, half empire, half eternity. The great dome of Hagia Sophia caught the moonlight in its gold mosaics so that the saints seemed to breathe. Artisans worked through the night, grinding lapis and silver into paint, tracing halos that glowed like distant planets. The city was a hymn in marble and echo. Yet beneath that glory, something softer moved, a theology that saw divinity not in brightness, but in the gentleness of reflection. And the stars are its choir unseen. No name follows it. Only a simple mark, a circle with a dot at its center. Some say it was Beatrice's signature. Others believe it represents the full moon, symbol of the secret choir that sang under its light. When evening comes to St. Madeleine now, the custodian lights a single candle in the nave. The flame sways in the draught, throwing shadows across the stone ribs of the ceiling. For a moment, the space fills again with possibility, as if invisible voices hover just beyond hearing, waiting for breath to join them. Perhaps that is the legacy of those hidden singers. Not rebellion, but reminder that devotion need not be loud, and faith need not belong to the powerful. It can survive in whispers, in lullabies, in harmonies shared among those who believe tenderness is also sacred. Musicologists who reconstructed one of the secret hours chants performed it once, in 2014, inside the restored chapel. They used no instruments, only 12 voices and candlelight. The recording lasts 4 minutes. At the final cadence, before the sound fades, there is a moment of resonance so long it seems the room itself is singing back. Afterward, the microphones caught another tone, faint and human, though no one in the ensemble had drawn breath. The technician marked it simply, "Unknown source." Maybe it was echo, or stone. or memory. The Sisters of St. Madeleine left no monument. Their names appear only in the faded red ink of those margins. Yet their song endures, folded into the fabric of the night, in the quiet between footsteps, in the pulse that slows as sleep approaches. If you listen now, truly listen, you might hear it. A single line of melody rising from far away, soft as a sigh. Kayla newt soit daus a ton aim, may the night be gentle to your soul. And the air, remembering, hums in answer. A chronicler named Theophanes once wrote of a sect who gathered by moonlight to pray in silence, their faces veiled, their lamps unlit. They believed the divine voice spoke only when the world slept, that revelation was not a trumpet, but a breath. The church called them lunarians, heretics who blurred the line between heaven and nature. Their leader, a woman known only as Irene of the Shore, taught that the soul was a tide pulled between God and dust. For this, her writings were seized, her followers dispersed. Yet one scroll escaped, hidden, perhaps, within a reliquary, carried across centuries like a secret pulse. At the edge of a ruined abbey in Normandy, beyond the cloister arches and the last intact wall of the refectory, lies a small garden. It is not marked on any map. Ivy conceals its entrance. Grass grows thick between broken stones. Yet if you step quietly through the archway where the old chapter house once stood, you will find it. A walled square of earth where statues sleep beneath the green weight of centuries. They stand in a circle, half-buried, faceless, their robes worn smooth by rain. Some lean, some have fallen, others remain upright, their eyes erased by lichen and moss. Around them grow roses gone feral, yarrow, foxglove, and the tall white bells of campanula. The air smells of damp stone and crushed time. Wind moves gently among the leaves, as though turning the pages of a book no one reads anymore. Locals call it Le Jardin des Saints Oubliés, the Garden of Forgotten Saints. The abbey was once called Saint-Pierre-sur-Lière. Founded in the early 12th century, it flourished briefly before the 100 Years' War left it shattered. When the soldiers came, the nuns fled. The church was burned, the relics looted, the statues toppled into the cloister well. Later, when peace limped back into the valley, villagers rebuilt the walls and replanted herbs in the courtyard. What grew became wild. What fell remained where it had fallen. The abbey was never reconsecrated. Only the garden survived. The statues are of saints who never made it into the official calendars. Their names, carved faintly on the plinths, belong to those erased by decree or time. Saint Columba the Healer, Saint Leontia the Pilgrim, Saint Dalmas of the Roads, Saint Meretrix of the Fountain. Each name a fragment, each life once carried in prayer by a handful of believers who could not bear to forget. When Rome revised its martyrologies, these names were struck out, their feast days lost. But the stones remained. In the late 19th century, when archaeologists catalogued the ruins, they found a record of the garden in an abbot's journal dated 1431. The images of those whom heaven no longer names are set in the south court, that nature may decide their fate. It seems the surviving monks, unwilling to destroy what had once been holy, moved the statues to the cloister and left them to the mercy of the seasons. 500 years later, that mercy endures. In spring, wild violets bloom between the feet of the statues. In autumn, ivy crowns their heads. When it rains, rivulets trace their faces, drawing tears on blank stone. Birds nest in the hollows where hands once held scrolls or lilies. Each statue carries its own ruin with a kind of dignity, as if holiness does not resist decay, but joins it. The garden feels alive in a way the restored churches nearby do not. Here silence has roots. It grows thick, like moss, covering what the world chose to forget. One statue still holds its shape, a woman carved from pale limestone, her arms extended as though to bless the earth itself. Her name, still legible, is Saint Leontia. Little is known about her. A single mention survives in a 12th century hagiography. She walked until her sandals broke, and when she prayed, the ground gave forth water. Perhaps she was a local hermit. Perhaps she never existed at all. But her likeness stands, worn and soft as river stone. Beneath her feet, The ground is always damp, even in summer. The parchment itself bears symbols: crescents, rivers, and a seven-pointed star, drawn in the margins beside verses that read like poetry more than law. When sunlight falls through the tangle of leaves, the garden becomes a quiet sea of gold. Dust dances in the air, and the statues seem to breathe. For a moment, they look less forgotten than simply waiting. In the 1920s, a painter from Rouen named Etienne Duval visited the abbey ruins while sketching landscapes. His diary records his astonishment. "I found a place where time itself has knelt down. The faces of the saints have melted into the faces of the earth." He painted the garden in soft strokes, gray stone against green shadow, and titled the canvas "Les Saints Effaces," the erased saints. The painting now hangs in a small museum in Cannes. Those who stand before it often fall silent without knowing why. Decades later, in 1978, a team of conservators surveyed the site for possible restoration. They concluded it should be left untouched. To restore, they wrote, would be to erase the only miracle that remains, the union of sanctity and soil. The French Ministry of Culture quietly agreed. The garden was never fenced, never labeled. It remains open to wind and memory. Visitors who find it, historians, pilgrims, wanderers, often leave offerings: a sprig of lavender, a candle stub, a folded piece of paper tucked between the stones. On many of those notes are not prayers, but names. People leave the names of their dead, they're lost, they're almost forgotten, as if by writing them here, they might be remembered in gentler company. Over time, the garden has become a reliquary for memory itself. Every few years, a botanist from Rouen comes to record the flora. She lists 32 species of wild herbs, all descended from monastic gardens of the 12th century. Plants once used for healing, now growing without care. Sage, rue, comfrey, mint. She calls the garden a living manuscript. Each season rewrites it. Each flower blooms where a word once stood. At dusk, when the sun sinks behind the abbey's western wall, the statues turn amber. The air cools and the first bats flicker through the twilight. Somewhere beyond the garden, the river carries the faint scent of rain. The silence becomes enormous. Not emptiness, but fullness, like breath held in reverence. There is a legend, still whispered in the village, that on the Feast of All Souls, when the church bells ring from the valley below, the statues hum. Not music exactly, but vibration, as if the stone remembers what it once meant to be prayed to. An acoustic engineer tested it once, placing sensors at the base of the figures. He detected faint resonance, caused perhaps by wind moving through the hollowed torsos. The readings showed a pitch near 108 Hz, low, human, soothing. "It sounds," he wrote, "like a sigh turned into stone. Perhaps that is all holiness ever was. A sigh turned toward heaven." There is one bench in the garden, made from an old lintel. From it, you can see the entire circle of statues, their shadows stretching long across the grass. Sit there long enough, and the rhythm of the place seeps into you. You begin to understand that forgetting and remembering are not opposites. They are partners in the same dance, the way shadow defines light, and decay makes beauty honest. At night, the stars appear between the branches, reflected faintly in puddles left by the last rain. The statues glimmer with dew, their missing eyes turned toward constellations that have outlived every empire. The garden feels infinite, though it is small enough to walk across in 30 steps. The moon is the mirror of the unseen. Sometimes a fox passes through, unafraid. Sometimes a traveler lights a candle and leaves it burning on a stone hand. In the morning, only wax remains, melted into the cracks like veins of gold. In recent years, an artist collective asked permission to record the garden's ambient tone. They brought microphones and left them overnight. When they listened later, they heard more than wind and birds. Underneath, there was a constant hum, subtle and low, as if the earth itself were singing. A note suspended between grief and peace. They titled their installation Resonance of the Forgotten. It toured museums for 2 years. In the final exhibition catalog, the curators wrote. The garden reminds us that the sacred is not lost, only quiet. No one tends the statues now. Moss climbs where fingers once pointed skyward. A vine wraps around a broken halo. Yet in that gentle neglect there is grace. The kind of grace that does not demand remembrance but invites it softly, like a breeze asking to be noticed. Each year, spring returns, and with it the first white blossoms of hawthorn, scattering petals like small benedictions across the faces of the saints. The petals settle in the hollows of their eyes, and for a brief moment, they seem to see again. The garden is never locked. Those who enter do so quietly, out of instinct. They speak little. They listen. The wind moving through the ivy sounds almost like chanting. The bees hum. The earth breathes. And perhaps, beneath all that growing and decaying, the saints still pray, not to be remembered by name, but simply to be part of the endless cycle of life and fading, to stand forever between silence and song. If you walk away at dusk and look back through the archway, you might notice how the last light pools around them, turning their faceless forms into silhouettes of gold. For a moment, they seem alive again, not as statues, but as presences. Then the light withdraws, and they return to stillness. The garden remains, half ruin, half resurrection, a hymn made of stone and root, and the wind, faithful as prayer, carries their nameless benediction outward into the world. Forget us not to remember, and in its dim light the angels breathe. Remember us not to forget. Dawn has not yet broken. The world holds its breath between darkness and the first suggestion of light. In a narrow stone room at the far end of a ruined abbey, a monk leans over a desk worn smooth by centuries of devotion. A single candle burns beside him, its flame trembling in the draught that slips through cracks in the shutter. Around him lie the fragments of a world ending quietly. Scattered pages, empty ink pots, the faint smell of wax and rain. The scriptorium has been abandoned for years. Once it rang with the rhythm of quills and whispers, the turning of vellum and the low murmur of psalms. Now only one voice remains, scratching softly across the page. The monk's name has been lost, but his work endures in the parchment before him, a copy of a text so old, so condemned, that its words have been rewritten and erased more times than the stars have changed their positions. It is said that this monastery, hidden deep in the hills of Provence, was one of the last refuges for books the world was not ready to remember. When war came, when ink was replaced by iron, the brothers hid what they could beneath the floorboards. Centuries passed. The walls cracked. The voices faded. Yet one night, a man returned, perhaps a descendant of the order, perhaps only a pilgrim, carrying a single page salvaged from ruin. A fragment of light, written in the hand of those who once believed that silence itself was sacred. He came to finish what they began. On his table lies the final sheet of vellum. The candlelight pools across it, illuminating the faint outlines of earlier texts. The ghosts of prayers scraped away and written over. The page glows softly, like skin. He writes not with haste but with reverence, shaping each letter as if it were a living thing. The world was written before it was spoken. What is remembered is only a small light, carried from hand to hand. Outside, the wind moves through the cypress trees, carrying the scent of rain. The monk pauses, listening. From somewhere beyond the walls comes the distant echo of a bell. Perhaps from the valley church, perhaps from memory itself. It tolls once, then disappears into the morning fog. He dips his quill again. The ink catches the flame's reflection, silver black. He continues. Historians who examined the fragments in the Byzantine Museum noted traces of beeswax and crushed lapis lazuli in the ink, an expensive pigment used only for icons or sacred objects. Whoever wrote these words believed they were painting holiness itself. Truth does not vanish. It sleeps. And when the world is silent enough, it begins to dream again. His script is a mixture of Latin and French, old and new. The letters curve like vines, every line breathing between faith and poetry. This is not transcription. It is resurrection. Each word feels like the lifting of dust from buried time. For a moment, he looks toward the window. The horizon has begun to pale, a thin blue line dividing night from day. It has been hours since he last moved. Wax has pooled around the candle base, solidifying into small rivers. He breathes softly, steady. Around him, the walls shimmer with faint echoes of their former life. The scriptorium seems to remember. The shelves that once held psalters and gospels now stand empty, yet under the candlelight their outlines return. Books that no longer exist, ghosts of bindings and gilded spines. The room feels full, as if the past has returned to witness its own transcription. He writes on. He copies the names that history deleted: Pelagia, Origen, Hildegard, Aidan, Beatrice, the quiet heretics, the erased singers, the painters and monks and mystics who spoke softly enough to survive through rumor and stone. He writes them not as rebellion, but as prayer. At last, he reaches the final line of the manuscript. He hesitates. The candle flickers. In that wavering light, his shadow moves across the page, merging with the ink. For a moment, scribe and script become one gesture, one breath. He writes, "May this light endure beyond the flame. May it pass into those who will listen." When the Ottoman Empire rose and Constantinople became Istanbul, the fragments vanished. Some say they were taken by French antiquarians in the 19th century. Others claim they remained beneath Hagia Irene, sealed behind plaster walls during the restorations of Sultan Mehmed II. But occasionally, scholars claim to see references. A copied phrase here, a paraphrased verse there, appearing in illuminated manuscripts found in Mount Athos or in the libraries of Venice, where Greek monks sought refuge. The words always return, like tides, and through them, into silence once more. The quill breaks. Its tip splinters, leaving a small blot of ink like a dark star. He sets it aside gently, as one would a wounded bird. Outside, the first ray of dawn touches the mountains. Pale gold seeps through the cracks in the shutter. The candle's flame wavers, outshone. The monk lifts the finished page and tilts it toward that fragile light. The ink shimmers, almost alive. For an instant, the words seem to lift from the parchment, as if they are being read by the sun itself. He smiles, not with triumph, but with the quiet understanding of one who has seen endings before. He knows this work will vanish too. The page will fade, the ink will dry, the world will turn. But the act of copying, of keeping the word alive for one more breath of time, is enough. He rolls the manuscript gently, ties it with a strip of linen, and places it inside a small wooden box. The box bears the marks of centuries, scratches, smoke stains, the faint scent of incense. He sets it inside a niche in the wall, where generations before him had hidden relics and letters. Then he seals it with wax. The candle burns to its final inch. Wax spills over the table, glistening like tears. The light softens, then fades. In the new dawn, there is no need for flame. He kneels not before an altar, but before the table itself. His voice, when it comes, is almost a whisper. Let what has been written return to silence. Let what has been hidden be remembered, and let the remembering be gentle. The message of the Gospel of the Moon is simple yet strange. It speaks of a faith that breathes, that changes with light, that refuses permanence. To worship the moon, it says, is to remember that all radiance is borrowed. Such a line would have been dangerous in an empire built on divine authority. For if the sun was Christ's eternal light, then the moon, changing, waning, veiled, threatened that certainty. And so the church silenced it. Outside, the valley begins to glow. Birds wake in the trees. The air fills with that strange, sacred stillness that always follows creation. When the work is done, and the world waits to exhale. In that silence, the candle dies. A thin wisp of smoke curls upward, catches the sunlight, and vanishes. But the room is not dark. The pages he has written shimmer faintly in the growing light, as though illuminated from within. It is not the reflection of the sun, nor the memory of the candle. It is the ink itself, the last illumination. The words breathe once, then fall still. By the time the villagers climb the hill later that morning, the monk is gone. The desk is empty save for a single feather, its tip stained black. The box in the wall remains sealed. And outside, beneath the cypress trees, the world continues. Quiet, luminous, unchanged. Centuries will pass. The abbey will crumble. Yet sometimes, when the dawn light enters the ruin at the right angle, visitors report a brief gleam on the wall. A golden script, visible only for a moment before fading again into stone. No one can read it. The letters are too bright. But those who see it leave in silence, carrying something of its light with them. A small, wordless faith that what was written in devotion never truly ends. It only changes form. And somewhere, deep in that stillness between night and day, yet even in silence, the moon remained. The ink still glows, the last illumination of a world that refused to forget its own sacred breath. In mosaics of the Virgin Mary, a thin crescent can sometimes be seen beneath her feet, a remnant of older symbols of Artemis, of Ishtar, of wisdom that predated the cross. Artists in Ravenna and Cappadocia painted her robes in silver blue, echoing the color of night seas. To the faithful, it was beauty. To the few who remembered the lunar gospel, it was a code, a reminder that divinity glows most when the world grows dim. There is one legend that speaks of a monk named Leonidas, who copied the lunar gospel by hand on nights of the full moon. He is said to have used ink mixed with ground pearl, so that each word shimmered faintly even when dry. His monastery stood near the Bosphorus, a place called Studios. When it was sacked in the 9th century, his brethren buried their scrolls in earthen jars, sealed with wax. In 1894, an earthquake split the old foundations, and workers reported finding clay containers filled with gray dust and shards of parchment that gleamed when wet. They thought them relics and handed them to the priests. None were seen again. Perhaps the scrolls disintegrated, or perhaps they were hidden once more, waiting for an age quiet enough to listen. The moon has always been the patient historian of our forgetting. It watches cities rise and fall, watches empires rewrite their saints. Every 14 nights it dies and is born again. A ritual older than writing, older than the very idea of sin. Maybe that is why those forgotten monks worshipped its rhythm, because they saw in it the true pattern of grace, disappearance, and return. When modern astronomers mapped the lunar surface, they named craters after philosophers and mathematicians, Copernicus, Plato, Archimedes, but none after the mystics who saw divinity in its phases. Yet their voices remain in art, in quiet theology, in the way churches still light candles for midnight mass. A small flame under vast darkness, that is the moon's language. There is a fresco fragment in the monastery of Daphne, near Athens. It shows Christ at the moment before dawn, the world still washed in indigo, his halo edged not in gold but in pale silver. Beneath the paint, infrared imaging revealed an earlier layer, a hand-drawn moon above his shoulder. Art historians call it a compositional guide. But perhaps it was homage, a silent nod to the belief that even the divine must borrow its light. The gospel of the moon asks no faith, offers no promise of salvation. It only reminds the listener that illumination and shadow are one breath apart. It tells us that mystery is not absence, but depth. That we do not lose the sacred when it hides, we only change how we see. In the quiet hours before sleep, the moon climbs slowly over the world's rooftops, casting its silver across stone, water, and time. It touches cathedrals and ruins alike. It erases the difference between what was condemned and what was adored. Somewhere beneath that same moon, perhaps still beneath the marble heart of Istanbul, the last copy of the lunar gospel may rest. A coil of silvered parchment waiting for light soft enough to reveal it. Or perhaps it has already dissolved back into the dust, its message absorbed into the rhythm of the night sky. The truth, like the moon, does not vanish when unseen. It merely turns its face away until we are ready to look gently enough. And if you listen closely, through the hush of your own breathing, through the slow pulse of distant centuries, you might still hear it. A voice beneath the veil of shadow, murmuring from some lost page. Faith is the quiet reflection of what you already are. In the hills of southern France, where lavender and wind share the same breath, there stands a chapel older than its stones admit. The villagers call it Saint Baume, the holy cave. Pilgrims come even now, climbing through oak forests to kneel before a hollow cut deep into the limestone cliffs. They say a woman once lived here, barefoot, silent, her hair grown long enough to clothe her. A woman who crossed the sea carrying a secret too heavy for words. For centuries, her name was whispered as Mary of Magdala. But what she carried, what she guarded, no one could quite agree. Some said she brought the cup of the Last Supper. Others, the words Christ spoke but never wrote. Beneath the chapel that now crowns the hill, archaeologists found a tomb. Smooth, unmarked, and empty. No bones, no relics, only a faint scent of myrrh that still lingers in the damp air. When monks of the Order of Saint Victor arrived in the 11th century, they claimed to find her remains elsewhere, in the crypt of Saint Maximin. Yet even their records spoke of two tombs, two Magdalens, one for the church, one for the silence. The second, they said, could not be opened, for inside lay nothing at all. And so it became known, in the language of faith and caution, as the tomb that wasn't empty. The story begins in light the color of dust, sunlight filtering through rose windows of the Provençal Basilica, painting the stone in wine and gold. Beneath that light, beneath altars and reliquaries and centuries of devotion, runs a network of tunnels carved from the ancient Roman quarry. The air smells of salt and earth. Along one wall, faint inscriptions in Greek name no saints, only verbs: to awaken, to remember, to return. In the 13th century, Dominican inquisitors came to these hills searching for heresy. They found the Cathars, a people who believed that the divine was trapped within matter, yearning to ascend like light through water. The church called them dualists, but the Cathars spoke of the Magdalene as La Consolata, the comforter, the one who knew the resurrection not as an event but as a presence that never left. Their writings, seized and burned, described a tomb that shone like glass, where nothing slept and nothing died. In 1279, a royal excavation ordered by Charles II of Anjou claimed to rediscover the saint's body in a marble sarcophagus, perfectly preserved. Yet contemporary witnesses described something strange. The sarcophagus was sealed with wax far older than the church above it, and the body vanished within decades, replaced by a reliquary of hair and bone whose origins no scholar could trace. Even the papal records hesitated. A note in Latin reads only, corpus inventum, sed non confirmatum, a body found, but not confirmed. Modern archaeologists who studied the site of Saint Maximin in the 1960s uncovered pre-Christian foundations beneath the basilica, traces of a Roman temple dedicated to Diana, goddess of the moon and the hunt. In its center was a stone basin, shaped like an open shell. Around it were scattered coins from the 1st century and shards of Phoenician glass. The idea of a tomb that was not a tomb, a vessel without a body, seemed to echo through each era like a refrain the earth refused to stop singing. Some historians, cautious and rational, suggest the legend grew from confusion of relics and the merging of local cults. But others, standing in the cave of Saint Baume as wind moans through the pines, feel something older stirring, as if the story remembers itself, even when belief forgets. Inside the cave, the walls glisten with mineral light, centuries of moisture crystallized into mica and quartz. Pilgrims light candles, their reflections multiplying in the stone until the chamber looks filled with tiny stars. Each flame becomes an echo of that empty tomb, proof that absence can also illuminate. In 1892, during renovations of the lower chapel, a mason struck a hollow in the wall and found a small lead box sealed with wax. Inside were fragments of parchment, almost dust, inscribed with faint Latin, Num vacua, sed plena silentio. Not empty, but full of silence. The words, when read aloud, seemed to shift the air itself, as though the tomb breathes. Scholars later argued the box was a medieval devotional object, a symbolic offering. Yet the handwriting, tested under infrared light, was traced to the 9th century, 200 years before the chapel existed. The ink contained particles of hematite, an iron pigment once used in Egypt to record funerary prayers. Whatever hand wrote those words believed silence to be a substance, not a void. Throughout Europe, echoes of this belief appear like scattered stars. in Ireland's beehive monasteries, where monks left tombs open to let the light breathe. In Armenian chapels carved into volcanic rock, their altars deliberately hollowed. In the Coptic desert, where hermits slept beside empty sarcophagi as reminders that resurrection was already within them. The idea was simple and vast, that holiness is not stored in bone, but in the space left behind. Standing in that French cave today, one might hear dripping water and mistake it for a pulse. The walls curve like a ribcage. The air trembles with centuries of chanting. Some visitors report a strange sensation. Not fear, but weight, as if the earth itself were remembering something sacred. Archaeologists from Aixen province once measured the acoustics of the grotto and discovered it resonates precisely at 111 Hz, a frequency known to induce calm and altered awareness. Whether coincidence or design, the effect is undeniable. Voices soften, heartbeats slow, and time seems to stretch thin as candle smoke. It is easy, then, to believe that something unseen lingers, not a ghost but an idea still alive. Perhaps that was the true miracle. Not a body preserved against decay, but a truth that could not be buried. The tomb was never empty because emptiness itself is full of breath, of memory, of waiting light. When dusk settles over the valley, the cave glows faintly in the distance. The pilgrims begin their descent, leaving behind 1,000 small flames that flicker like constellations. From afar, it looks as if the hill itself is breathing. In the basilica below, the reliquary gleams behind glass. A fragment of bone, a strand of hair, a story. But in the dark above, the real reliquary endures. The space, the silence, the question left unanswered. Some truths do not require proof. They ask only to be felt. And so the chapter closes, with the cave asleep beneath its weight of stone. The air heavy with incense and sea wind. The silence vast enough to hold the memory of every name ever erased. Perhaps the tomb was never meant to contain a body at all. Perhaps it was a mirror, showing us that what we seek in relics and resurrection has been breathing beside us all along. In the heart of Spain, in a city of dust and bells, there once stood a cathedral whose angels did not look toward heaven. They looked downward, sorrowful, human, almost afraid. Their wings were folded not in triumph but in grief. For centuries, they adorned the vaulted ceilings of Toledo's lesser churches, painted by hands that believed divinity was not light, but flame. By the late 15th century, when the Spanish Inquisition burned through the land like a dry wind, art itself became a confession. Every brushstroke could be judged, every shadow a test of obedience. In that climate of holy fear, an anonymous painter, perhaps a monk, perhaps a student of El Greco before El Greco was born, began a series of frescoes unlike any seen before. They were called Los Angeles Catos, the fallen angels, though they were not demons. They were radiant beings captured in the moment of doubt, painted in deep ochre and ash, with wings of gold leaf peeling into darkness. They seemed not to fall, but to descend gently, like feathers returning to earth. In their faces lingered something heretical, compassion. When the paintings were discovered decades later, by bishops inspecting the side chapel of San Miguel de los Reyes, they were declared dangerous. Angels were meant to inspire awe, not empathy. They were to be pure, untouched by grief. To paint them weary was to blur the distance between the divine and the human. And so, under royal decree, the frescoes were ordered to be destroyed. Their beauty buried beneath white plaster, their colors suffocated by lime. But destruction, in art as in faith, is never complete. When restorers centuries later stripped back that plaster, they found not empty walls but ghost images. Shadows of wings, faint halos of smoke where once gold had been. The paint had burned into the stone itself, leaving silhouettes that shimmered under torchlight like memories refusing to fade. The walls seemed to breathe heat, as if the angels were still burning within. Art historians traced their composition to the late 1400s, during the height of the Inquisition. Pigment analysis showed the use of hematite red and bone black, materials once used in funerary icons from Byzantium. The technique was older than Spain, older than Christianity's authority in the West. Perhaps the painter had studied manuscripts brought from Sicily or the Levant. places where angels were seen as messengers of doubt as much as grace. There are records in the archives of Valencia of a trial held in 1492. A painter accused of depicting heavenly beings in the likeness of mortal suffering. His name is lost, only the phrase remains, Pintor de las Sombras Santas, the painter of the holy shadows. He was last seen in the monastery of San Juan de los Reyes, after which the records fall silent. Some say he was executed, others that he fled north carrying a single canvas rolled beneath his robe, the last of the burning angels. In 1936, during the Spanish Civil War, an American art historian named Ellen Gordon claimed to have found that very canvas in a ruined chapel near Burgos. Her notes, published posthumously, describe an image half consumed by fire. A winged figure standing in smoke, one hand over its chest, the other reaching toward an unseen flame. The pigment had blistered, the face half erased, but in what remained there was no fear, only acceptance. She wrote, "It looked as though the angel was not being punished but purified. Whether that painting still exists is uncertain." The chapel was destroyed by bombardment months later, and no trace was ever found. But Gordon's sketches survive, and in them, the angels lean toward the viewer, as if confessing something they have carried too long. To look at them, even in copies, is to feel the hush of confession, the soft surrender that follows understanding. The painter, whoever he was, must have known the danger of his vision. He must have known that to paint divine sorrow was to challenge the fire that burned heretics and books alike. Yet still he painted, perhaps at night, under candlelight, with the smell of smoke seeping through the convent walls. The church of the late 15th century was a place of splendor and terror in equal measure. Cardinals debated theology in marble halls while pyres glowed outside. The air of Castile was thick with the scent of incense and burning parchment. Faith, once intimate, became spectacle. Angels were turned into soldiers, miracles into laws. Yet somewhere, in that vast machinery of salvation, one artist dared to show the divine not as triumphant, but tired. His angels did not fall, they descended. They did not rebel, they wept. To some, that was blasphemy. To others, it was mercy. In 1981, a team restoring frescoes in Toledo Cathedral's south transept uncovered faint traces of flame patterns beneath later Renaissance paint. The brushstrokes matched those described by Gordon. Infrared imaging revealed an underpainting of wings, 6 pairs overlapping, interlocked like leaves. The pigments still glowed faintly red under ultraviolet light. When the restorers stepped back, one whispered, "They're still burning." No one spoke for a long while after. The heat that lingers in pigment is not fire. It is memory. The same dust that once covered the painter's hands still lives in the air of those chapels. Perhaps that is why, even now, visitors describe a strange warmth when they stand before the restored frescoes, as though the stone itself carries a pulse. Legends grew around these angels. Some said they guarded those who doubted, that their presence offered forgiveness to souls too gentle for doctrine. Others said their flames consumed lies, that they burned away not sinners, but false certainty. Pilgrims came in secret to light candles before the blackened walls, leaving prayers written on thin parchment, folded into the cracks like small offerings of surrender. Today, most of those chapels have been renovated, repainted, modernized. The walls are smooth again, clean. The official guides make no mention of the burning angels. Yet under certain light, when the sun slips through the rose windows at dusk, faint outlines reappear, like the afterimage of a candle just blown out. It is said that art remembers what the world forgets. And sometimes, what the world burns, art preserves in silence. When night falls over Toledo, the cathedral towers gleam like embers. The streets below fill with the scent of wax and stone. Somewhere, deep within the walls, beneath centuries of whitewash, those angels may still be watching, not as judges but as witnesses. Their wings folded, their eyes lowered, their fire eternal. Perhaps the painter never meant to defy heaven. Perhaps he only wanted to remind it that even angels must weep. And in that weeping, the sacred and the human become one. Flame and breath, joined in the soft, consuming silence of faith remembered, then forgotten, then found again. The bells toll for vespers, the candles gutter, and as the cathedral sleeps, the faint warmth beneath the plaster stirs once more. A slow exhale from a painting that refused to die. The angels still burn, not in punishment, but in remembrance. And somewhere between their wings, perhaps, lies the quiet truth the painter knew, that light itself is born from fire, and that what burns is never truly lost. Beneath the cobblestones of a quiet European town, one that tourists pass through without knowing its name, lies another city. Not ruins in the ordinary sense, not the tidy stones of archaeology displayed in glass, but a buried breath of time itself. The town above is Chartres in France, its cathedral famous, its streets filled with the murmur of cafes and pilgrims. But below, beneath the weight of centuries and the hum of life, sleeps something older than Christendom, older than prayer. The entrance is small, hidden behind a grate near the apse of the cathedral. Only those who work in restoration or in silence are permitted below. There, through narrow corridors damp with centuries of condensation, you descend into a world where torchlight becomes a language. The walls twist, curving like the inside of a shell, each turn older than the last.